He's one of India's finest lawyers, a man who was at the forefront of the fight against decriminalizing homosexuality in India. And one day, Saurabh Kirpal could become India's first openly gay judge of a constitutional court. Last year, in a historic move, the Supreme Court Collegium recommended Saurabh Kirpal's elevation as a judge of the Delhi High Court. But his file has been pending with the central government, which is just sitting on it. Some years ago, his promotion as a judge was stalled by the Intelligence Bureau on the grounds that his partner is a Swiss national. Right now, there is silence from the centre on why it is delaying his appointment. This comes at a time when the law minister and top Supreme Court judges have openly disagreed about the way judges are appointed. Well, Saurabh Kirpal joins us on NDTV now. He's written a new book on 15 judgments of the Supreme Court that have shaped India's financial landscape. Thank you very much, Saurabh Kirpal, for joining us. Let's talk about your book first. In your introduction, you say that it sometimes seems that the Supreme Court is running the country. It has an outsized role in governance compared to other apex courts around the world. And as your book documents, there are a number of Supreme Court judgments that have had a huge bearing on our lives and certainly on the nation's economic health. Tell us why you decided to write this.
The Supreme Court, of course, every day decides public interest litigations. And we read about that in the media, etc. So we are all well aware of that aspect of the Supreme Court's functioning. I think half the newspaper front page every day is what the Supreme Court said, or some judge made some comment in the earlier day. But I think the extent to which they decide matters of economy and especially political economy is often just only noticed in the pink papers. The common person does not get to know exactly what the Supreme Court has decided. And the 15 judgments that I have discussed in this book are just some examples of the far-reaching impact that the court has on the economy of the country. For instance, take the issue of the IBC that we discussed, the Insolvency Act. The Supreme Court has allowed the government of the day which is the current government, to have the insolvency proceeding and the Insolvency Act so that companies can be resolved in a particular manner. It was open for the court to have struck it down, but they didn't. And by doing so, they upheld a certain political and economic philosophy of the government. So every day when a court takes a decision on the legal aspect of a particular dispute before it, it also requires itself to take a view on the constitutional aspect, the economic aspect, and inevitably the political aspect of a decision. So that's why it has an outsized role, I'd say.
Well, it's interesting just the sheer topics in terms of the judgments that you've chosen that have shaped India's economic and financial destiny. And when you look at the judgments that you've chosen to write about, I see, you have the privacy judgment, Aadhaar, and the Vishakha judgment on sexual harassment at the workplace. And I don't think we often realize it, but all of these have had an impact on our daily lives. We don't often realize that.
Yeah, absolutely. The Aadhaar judgment, it's become so common, Aadhaar, that we don't realize the economic effect it has on everybody's life. So, for instance, the poorest of the poor, if you have an Aadhaar card, you have access to government schemes, you have access to money. And we saw that during the second wave, when a large number of migrants did not have Aadhaar, then they could not actually access the money because you were required to give the Aadhaar card and access grants. So, upholding the Aadhaar scheme in the way that the Supreme Court did had a tremendous impact on the lives of people who were the very people for whom Aadhaar was allegedly made for. See, Aadhaar was made for people who did not have access to proof of residence. They could theoretically move anywhere in the country and get their ration or other benefits. But since often that is not done in practice, it was very difficult for Aadhaar to fulfill its promise. Now, of course, when the court is judging the issue of the constitutionality, they don't necessarily take these things into account. They're not supposed to take into account. They're supposed to only decide the constitutionality. But I think the court did have certain sympathies about how Aadhaar's scope was being expanded. So I think we've now forgotten it. But when the Aadhaar scheme had first come, pretty much for everything the government was asking for Aadhaar, from entering even the airport to postage, etc., telephones, bank accounts, everything. you needed Aadhaar for that. But the court struck that down, saying that no, you cannot ask for Aadhaar when you get a telephone, because that will allow the government to trace how you are actually behaving. So the government upheld the privacy, the court upheld the privacy, tried to balance it, but that had an effect inevitably by allowing you to have a phone without having Aadhaar means people who don't get Aadhaar also have access to telephony services in India.
Absolutely. Saurabh Kirpal, there's been a lot of scrutiny of the higher judiciary lately, and especially the Supreme Court, and we've seen in recent days a fresh disagreement between the government and the higher judiciary about the appointment of judges. Now, your own appointment as a High Court judge is pending because the centre is sitting on the Supreme Court Collegium's recommendation. How has this wait been for you, and why do you think there's been this long delay?
I think the wait has been taken so long because I have already said this in many other spaces. The reason is my sexuality. I don't think the government necessarily wants to appoint openly gay person to the bench. And that's, of course, not the stated reason. And that is part of the problem with the collegium system. They don't give reasons as to why they've taken a decision, but that's also then the problem with the government not following the law as is. They don't give reasons as to why they're sitting on certain files. Nidhi, for instance, I am not one of those people who thinks that the collegium system is a good system. I think there are many flaws with it. It needs to be improved. Maybe the government needs to have some formal role in appointment of the judges, as the NJAC, the earlier constitutional amendment had envisaged. But that was struck down, right? The government cannot be a sore loser and say that what we thought was right, and which I agree with the government was probably right, is not the law anymore. And just because you don't think the current procedure is correct, doesn't mean you don't follow it, right? You may disagree with what the collegium system is, but that is the law of the land, and you have to follow it, good, bad, indifferent. Because not to follow it means you are not obeying the constitutional mandate as interpreted by the Supreme Court. If you think that judgment is wrong, they must ask for a review of that judgment, which they haven't. It has been 4 years since that judgment was passed, striking down the NGAC, but it has not been questioned. So till that is done, the way every citizen of the country obeys the law, I think the government is also bound by the same judgment and the collegium system.
But what is glaring is that others who were recommended for judges' positions along with you, they have got their appointments, but you have not. Now, Section 377 is history. And therefore, do you think that there's still a prejudice against you because of your sexual orientation, because of the fact that you are gay? Do you believe that the government is still uncomfortable with that, even now?
Well, I can only assume that to be the case. No one from government, or indeed no one from the collegium, has ever reached out to me for my inputs. So, for instance, very often I've heard that the reason given is that my partner is a human rights activist. But he's not. He's working as a visa officer in the embassy. It has nothing to do with human rights. But obviously, no one has ever contacted me, so I can't give any kind of a clarification. To the extent you think the government is still against a certain view, has a certain view on 377 and homosexuality, well, to be fair to the government, they never opposed the decriminalization of 377. They never filed that affidavit saying that it should stay criminalized. But we have seen the view of the government in the marriage equality petitions that are pending before the Delhi High Court, where they have very candidly and openly said that marriage can only be between a biological man and a biological woman. Now, that is a very outdated view of what it means to be a queer person, what it means to have a certain position on issues of sexuality. So, of course, there is a view within the government which is probably more conservative than is the case elsewhere. So, while 377 itself is gone, I think all the other attributes of full personhood, full citizenship that judgment promised, that is yet to be accomplished. And that is, I think the government is a bit behind. Even the Trans Act, for instance, the fact that trans people do not get reservations, even though that was promised in the judgment, shows that there is a certain reticence in accepting the fact that the trans community, the queer community, is a disadvantaged community, and the government needs to go that extra mile to ensure equality.
Well, despite all this, do you still see a ray of hope in that, you were at the forefront in the fight to decriminalize homosexuality, and we recently had a very progressive judgment from the Supreme Court on abortions. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the US in particular, it gives you some hope that, you have judgments like this here. So does that give you hope that at least the higher judiciary is trying to change?
I have complete faith in the courts and a great hope. There is a bunch of petitions that have been filed and pending at the Delhi High Court, and that those petitions would not have been filed if we felt that the court was not capable of or not willing to deliver on the promise that was first held out in the 377 judgment. You mentioned the judgment of Chief Justice Chandrachud in the abortion matters. That is an extremely progressive judgment, especially when we compare that to overturning of Roe versus Wade in the US Supreme Court. We've had a series of very liberal judgments. People often like to mock the Supreme Court or knock it on certain judgments that it makes, but we forget that it is a very liberal space. Look, Nidhi, the very fact that someone who's openly gay like me could be nominated as a judge of the High Court by the Collegium of the High Court and affirmed by the Collegium of the Supreme Court shows that these judges who made the recommendation and approved it are liberal people, right? So it is a liberal space, undoubtedly. But we must also remember that a lot of what judges do are through the judgments that they write, not through the speeches that they make, not through seminars that are given. So I hope that they carry through that promise of that 377 judgment and the abortion judgment and all the other statements that have come judicially over the last 10 years. Well, I think the promise that has been upheld of the Constitution and of the Founding Fathers will be fulfilled by this bench.
Well, Saurabh Kirpal, more power to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us so openly and so frankly today, and I hope that that file is cleared by the centre soon and you do become a judge of the Delhi High Court. This is the book, 15 Judgments, that you have written. If I can show that on full screen. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.